I said last Sunday that I'm not a huge fan of edited readings, which the lectionary gave us last Sunday, 2 chunks of scripture separated by some missing verses. And the same thing has happened this morning. We have an edited reading, as Yvette pointed out at the beginning of the reading this morning. Yvette read 7 verses and David read 8 verses. But they're separated by 5 missing verses. And if you want to get those missing verses, you could go and look them up in your Bible in Matthew chapter 13. But even better, you could come back next Sunday to Zoom Church. I won't be there. I won't be here. But you will get a wonderful, really wonderful, I've already seen it, really wonderful sermon from Jennifer Charlo on the missing verses, and then a few after the end of the section we read this morning. And I hope when you hear Jennifer's comments next Sunday about the missing verses, I hope you are struck, as I was when I listened to her words, about how she captures why it is that those missing 5 verses are absolutely essential to understanding the verses, the parable of the wheat and the weeds, and why it is that we really, really need those missing 5 verses. I also said last Sunday that I'm not a huge fan of explanations attached to parables. It only happens twice, and we've had both cases in the last 2 weeks. Last Sunday, we had the sower and the seed, which has an application or an explanation attached, but again with missing verses in the middle between the actual parable and the explanation. And now this morning we have a parable and then an attached explanation after some missing verses. And there are scholars, I said last Sunday, there are scholars who think that the explanations in fact are not original, that they don't really belong to Jesus, but they came out of the early church. Regardless of that, it doesn't really matter what you think about that. But the problem with the explanations is that they make a direct equivalency. So there's one thing in the parable, and then there's one thing in the explanation that explains that one thing in the parable. And so it kind of closes down your reading of the parable. It shuts down some of the expansiveness and creativity, I think, that we're supposed to bring to our understanding and our reading and our use of these parables. It prevents us in some ways from paying attention to the details of the parable itself. And so I want to look this morning briefly with you at some of the details that I think are really important. And the first one comes right at the beginning. Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. And the first detail I want you to notice about that is the word good. The Greek word is kelos, and it's a magnificent word. It means beautiful, it means excellent, it means choice, the most chosen seed. It means absolutely precious. But the next little detail that I want you to notice, and here's where the explanation becomes a problem. Jesus says that someone sowed good seed in his field. The explanation says the field is the world, and I'm sure that's true. But that's not all that the field is. You're also the field. And the good seed is sown in you. And that means, in some way, we are the good seed. That we are the beautiful, excellent, choice, precious seed that is sowed in the world in order that the beauty and the truth and the goodness and the light of Jesus might be seen everywhere. So that wherever we go, we carry with us that good seed. We become a fruitful crop of love and light in the world around us. But there's another translation of kalos that is translated as good that is quite intriguing, and I can see why the translators didn't use this translation in this context, because it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But it's actually quite beautiful, and I think it fits the parable really well. So kalos can be beautiful, can be good, excellent, choice, precious. But kalos can also be honest. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed honest seed in his field, truthful seed, seed that is honest about who it is, about its condition in life. And I think that's why this parable is so important, because when we're honest, when we're truthful, we understand that in the world, in the human community, in our own lives, at times, there's not always only just good, beautiful, excellent, choice, precious seed. Sometimes there are weeds as well. Sometimes there are things that go bump in the night. Sometimes there are things that are not the way we would want them to be. And all of life, every human being, all of creation, it's all a mix. That's really the story of Noah and the ark, that life is a mix. It's a complicated, complex amalgamation of things that we love and cherish and things that we wish somehow could be different than they are. Some of you might remember that back a few months before this whole COVID thing got roaring around at the beginning of 2020, that the church was broken into. It was actually broken into twice. And on one of the break-ins early in the year, some things were stolen from the church building. And one of the things, curiously, that was stolen was the large alms plate that we use. You know, it sits up, leans up against the wall at the east end of the church behind the altar. And at a certain time in the altar, at a certain time in the service, someone brings it forward and holds it out, and receives the offering. And they stole that, and I can't imagine they stole most of the sound system too, which makes a little more sense. But what are you gonna do? The only thing I could think is maybe they were going to use it as a very large ashtray, or maybe they thought it was gold, in which case it could be melted down and sold for something. But boy, they're in for disappointment because it wasn't gold at all. Anyway, so that was stolen. And so we went looking for another one, and Kathy Fife did some research and found some that in the catalogs or online looked nice enough. Quite expensive, but we figured insurance would cover it. So Kathy ordered one, and it came all carefully packaged up, and she opened it up, and it was very chintzy, and it was in terrible condition. It was marked and had scrapes on it and scratches on it, and it just didn't work. So Kathy faithfully bundled it back up and sent it back, which left us without an alms plate. So then Kathy got the bright idea of wondering whether maybe some Anglican church had one they weren't using. And, you know, we closed down a bunch of Anglican churches a while ago, and so there has been stuff lying around. She contacted the diocese, and lo and behold, they had one. And they would give it to us. So they gave us this alms plate, but it was also in quite ill repair. It was marked and scratched and really in rough shape. So Kathy, ever resourceful, went looking and found someone in Victoria, I guess, who said they would re-lacquer it and make it look beautiful again. And so they said that there was some problems, difficulties getting the lacquer to adhere perfectly, but they had done the best they could. And so Kathy showed us what this new plate was going to look like. And it looks like that. I hope you can see that. It looks beautiful and smooth and shiny and just really lovely. It's a perfect alms plate. Just looks, look at that, eh? Doesn't need polishing. It's nicely lacquered. It looks fabulous. But I'm going to be too smart, too clever here by half. Oh, there we are. But then Kathy turned it over. And on the back of this beautiful alms plate, if you look closely, you'll see that in spots, the lacquer hasn't taken perfectly. And so there are little bubble spots around the rim on the back. And so it is a little bit, this alms plate is a little bit blemished. It's not absolutely perfect. And I think that is absolutely perfect. I think that's exactly the alms plate that we want. We want an alms plate that is a mix of good, perfect, beautiful, excellent seed and a little bit of wheat, a little bit of weeds on the back, because that is, there's a Japanese concept called wabi-sabi, and wabi-sabi looks at life and says everything to some degree is just a little bit imperfect. All of life is impermanent and everything is just a tiny bit incomplete. I was saying earlier in the chat time that Louise Ferguson got me watching a thing on Netflix. It's called Donald Trump, An American Dream. Donald Trump, An American Dream. There's 4 episodes. Heather and I have watched 2 of them. And it should be subtitled An American Nightmare. But this was a man who believed that with enough money and with enough power, he could create something absolutely perfect. No blemishes. And it's crumbling all around him. Even by the time you get to episode 2, it's beginning to crumble and the cracks are starting to show, and you begin to even in episode 1. And now there's a few beginning to show around and about as well, it seems to me. And so what this parable is inviting us to do is to recognize that. There's beautiful, good, excellent, choice, precious wheat. And honestly, there are also weeds. And the problem in the parable, of course, is that there are these people, these slaves who work for the householder, and they have a great plan. When the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to the master, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done this." And the slave said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" See, the tragedy of life is not that there are weeds. That's not the problem. The tragedy in life is that there are those who believe that they can root out all the flaws and all the perfections and create something that is absolutely, utterly, and totally without a slight flaw. You all know, I'm sure, I'm sure I've quoted it a million times. Leonard Cohen understood this. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. But it's also how the light gets out. And so the story of Noah was right. God is not going to root out the weeds. God is never going to root out the weeds. God is going to let them grow together so that ultimately the goodness and the purity and the truth of God may be seen in all things. And the challenge for us is to find ways to live with the weeds. And in fact, maybe even that's the way that the beauty comes, that the beauty and the goodness are seen as we embrace and live with our weeds, as we learn to accept and even to cherish our blemishes, because it's the blemishes that let the beauty be seen. It's our recognition of our fragility, of our fragile nature, that allows the true strength of who we are to shine forth. As the Wabi-Sabi says, it's when we can receive the imperfect, when we acknowledge that which is impermanent, and when we see that life is incomplete just as it is, and accept it and live with it here and now. It's then that the beauty of the good seed begins to shine forth. So it's a fundamental call, I think, of Christian life, to be honest, to be clear about the nature of life, to not pretend to a perfection that we do not possess and cannot possess, and not even to strive for a perfection that we can't possess, because it's not in the flawlessness of our lives that God is seen. It's in fact in the cracks. It's in those imperfect places. It's in the parts that are incomplete. The light and the truth and the blessing of God's presence is known among us. So if we ever get back into the building and you see that beautiful, shiny new plate, don't forget, there are little bubbles on the back, little flaws, little bits of imperfection. And that's where the real gift of life is found.